PATV presents Live from Prairie Lights, featuring the best authors and poets on the scene today. From up-and-coming to well-established writers from across the globe. You'll see them right here on PATV.
No, I did not. No, I did not. I asked her to pick them up.
Just desperate. Good evening. Thank you for coming tonight. Welcome to Prairie Lights. I'm Kathleen Johnson. I work here at Prairie Lights, and we're very pleased to have a special presentation for you tonight from the book We Wanted to Be Writers. It's co-written by Eric Olsen and Glenn Schaeffer, and we have Gordon Meninga also reading some of it. So all four of us will read, and I'll introduce Eric Olsen to say a few more words. Thank you.
So, as Kathleen said, we'll be reading from We Wanted to Be Writers. It's a collection of conversations about writing with nearly 30 of our classmates and teachers here at Iowa 30 plus years ago, 35 now. Among them, John Irving and Marvin Bell, a couple of our teachers and classmates, including Jayne Smiley, T.C. Boyle, Alan Gerganis, Sandra Cisneros, and Jayne Anne Phillips. And none of these folks I know need an introduction, but I guess Glenn and Gordy and I do. So Gordon, like us, got his MFA here in '77 in fiction, and his fiction has appeared in the North American Review, Northwest Magazine, Seams, Folio, and other publications. He's written for NPR's Good Evening and Garrison Keillor's A Prairie Home Companion. And one of the monologues he wrote for Keillor provided the basis for the film Every Day, released in 1999. And he currently teaches creative writing and film studies at Coe College in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And if you don't know Gordy, that's Gordy down there. Hi, Gordy. And Glenn, this is Glenn, is a business exec who made his name in gaming and entertainment, and you've probably seen his name, if you've been by the workshop, you've seen his name on that nifty steel and concrete and glass building next to the day house. Lots of people are puzzled by how a guy with an MFA in writing would end up in gaming, but it makes perfect sense. On the one hand, there's not a lot of difference between writing and gambling. Those of you who write know, and I mean, not that the guys who run the games are ever really gambling. But more to the point, as Glenn explains in the book, an MFA is the ideal preparation for the business world, where creative thinking and the ability to craft a compelling narrative are essential to success. Glenn's also a literary philanthropist and art collector of some note. And now, after a hiatus of 30-odd years, he's finishing up his MFA dissertation, Holy Shaker, about a tent show evangelist in the Oklahoma Panhandle during the Dust Bowl. And my name is Eric Olsen, and after Iowa, I became a freelance magazine writer and editor, and to pay the rent while I wrote my great American novel, which I figured I'd wrap up in a year or two and sell and be rich and famous. And in the years since, I've cranked out hundreds of magazine articles and 6 books, counting this one, all nonfiction, and no great American novel, which maybe is just as well, because I gather the great American novel is passé. But, and I continue to plug away at a novel, and of course the obligatory screenplay. And we arranged the conversations in the book by topics, such as how we got hooked on writing in the first place, what we learned at Iowa or didn't learn but wish we had, and what we learned or didn't in the 3 decades since about life, art, teaching, and so on. And Glenn, Gordy, and I are going to read ourselves, plus the other guys who are part of this conversation. And Kathleen has been kind enough to read all the women. And I know there were a few. And I know this may seem sexist, but believe me, none of you want me being Jayne Smiley this evening. So this evening we're going to read from a couple of chapters. In the interest of pacing here, I kind of mushed some material from 2 chapters into this one script, and so we're going to be reading from a couple of chapters in which the discussion turns to the creative process. And there seems to be a professional insistence that writing can't be taught. And it's certainly true that someone's always snarking about workshops and workshop writing, and Iowa in particular, big fat target that we are. And but setting aside the matter of how or if, this waffling does get at a basic mystery of creativity, what it is, where it comes from, and how we can get more of it. And this speculation about it has probably been going on as long as there have been storytellers and other creative types to speculate. And what all of this pondering seems to point to again and again is that creativity, whether in the arts, sciences, politics, business, or any other human endeavor for that matter, is a process with several characteristic steps. And we argue in the book that this process is something that can certainly be practiced and honed and refined, and at least some aspects of it can be learned or relearned, perhaps most effectively in a community of people sharing their struggles and small triumphs. And with that, I will turn it over to Glenn.
I'm going to read an excerpt from myself, and then we'll just have these conversations going as we adopt different personae. You hear how cutthroat the workshop is, but that was never my experience. I was never with a group of aspirants, less competitive than my fellow Iowans. You want a bunch of snarks, try getting your PhD in literary criticism at UC Irvine, which I was doing before I got straight and landed at Iowa. At Iowa, we knew it was a boot camp and that we were going to be shipped out and go to war for cultural or market stakes, and some of us would get promotions and some would be annihilated. But we were in this thing together. At Irvine, there was no together. It was plain cutthroat. Clued in advance, your classmates would go to the research library, check out all of the recommended texts, and hide them under their beds for the entire semester. I had to buy a library card for USC down the road so I could get any work done. At Iowa, the biggest neurotics were not the students. They were always on the faculty. The screwballs purposely recruited to lead us.
And I'm reading as Jayne Smiley. I am not Jayne Smiley, but I'm reading as Jayne Smiley. We go to workshops for community, to meet like-minded people. Most writers don't succeed if they're just sitting in a room but not getting out. If you look back at the history of the novel, nearly everyone who succeeded was part of some sort of literary group. There is hardly anyone who thrives on being solitary. Think of Virginia Woolf and her circle. They supported one another and talked to one another and talked about literature. Thackeray and his friends, the same. People do it in New York City as a matter of course, so the idea that you would somehow not thrive in a more communal environment is absurd.
Exactly. The real workshop was community. Ross Howell, another workshopper, was my neighbor, and we talked fiction all the time. We go fishing every evening all summer long at a little park outside of Iowa City, Kent Park. And while we fished, we'd talk. Then we get to class, and the discussions would become brittle, and everyone had to put in their 2 cents worth, and half the time you wanted to ask, have you actually read my story? Sometimes people hadn't. People complained about things that didn't matter, and they left some important things totally untouched. At least that's the way we felt. Sometimes a teacher saw through that. Sometimes a teacher would let people attack a writer on and on and on the silliest grounds. The weirdest class I ever had, and I mean weirdest in a good way, was from Rosalind Drexler, whose reputation was probably at that time a writer who wrote the novelization of Rocky, but she'd also been a pro wrestler before that under the name of Rosa Carlo, the Mexican Spitfire.
And let me jump in. Had she continued to paint as a pop artist, would have been the most important female painter in pop art.
And we all knew that was going to happen, so we were very friendly to her. But anyway, she was great. She was a breath of fresh air. When you saw her, you thought pro wrestling as well as literature. And you couldn't pull any literary crap in her class at all. For instance, if somebody started talking about Proust, she would say, "Who?" And everyone would relax and we'd have a wonderful conversation. The other thing she didn't let people do was get terribly negative, because she did not understand negativity. She only understood the positive part of writing. She knew how hard it was.
As Sandra Cisneros. I believe in workshops. I teach workshops. I don't just believe in the academic workshop. I believe in alternative workshops. As writers, we're required to write alone, but I like to use the metaphor of writing being like cutting your own hair. There's only so much you can do for yourself, and then you need someone to help you with the back. That's what we do at workshop. We cover each other's back. So you don't walk out with a bad haircut, so someone doesn't say, "Damn, where'd you get that bad haircut?" But you have to be with people you can trust.
Me again. This is more about this whole writing thing. You can take people who are not very good at writing, this is my opinion, and you can help them improve a lot. That's one thing we learned as writers over time. You can see what their fears are, and they'll say things like, you'll say things to people, "Why don't you write more dialogue?" And they'll say, "Well, because I'm not good at it." And then you say, "Well, maybe you should write more dialogue and you will be good at it." That seems to be the process of getting better in writing. At the workshop, I felt like we were always being damped down. Not encouraged to take many risks because it wasn't so much same think, I said that in the interview, but it was just that if we got too wild, somehow we'd tip over the cart. And sometimes, for instance, someone put up a story once that had a 3-page sentence, and people thought that was way too wild for literature. I thought it was a pretty good one. Bill Kinsella, who wrote Shoeless Joe, the movie was Field of Dreams, was in our class. And he would put up quite good stories, and he did this as a test. And the people would fall on them with knives. Because they were either too light or they were too effusive or too abstract or something. And Kinsella would say, this is Bill Kinsella, "That's okay, I already published them in Canada." And I think Sandra Cisneros fell into that trap too. That I don't want to say she was overlooked necessarily, but I think people thought that maybe if her characters died more often or had more philosophical stuff in their head, that she would have been a star. That's all questionable.
As Jane Smiley. In that period, the teachers tended to be men of a certain age with the idea that competition was somehow the key, the Norman Mailer period. The story was that if you disagreed with Norman or gave him a bad review, he'd punch you in the nose. You were supposed to get in fights in restaurants. That was the model, and maybe it was a New York thing. Gordon Lish came, and he was hard on you, and Ted Solotoroff was in that too. Stanley Elkin used that "who do you think you are" teaching method, which was supposed to arouse your pride and challenge you to greatness, but the teaching style I preferred was more cooperative. By the mid-70s, we students were shifting from that macho school, even if our mentors were not. It just wasn't an Iowa City thing. We were a group of like-minded people. Why fight among ourselves?
As normal, I was the outlier. I believed entirely in the macho school of writing and devoted my entire tenure at the Writers' Workshop to fighting Golden Gloves in the AAU. At which point, Vance Borgelli, and Eric's to blame for this, Vance Borgelli offered to set up a fight between me and Norman Mailer for 3 rounds for the charity here for the Iowa Writers' Workshop. I wanted that fight. Because I was immediately calculating, Mailer was 30 years older than me, a little shorter, probably not as fast. I'm going to take that fight. And I said to Eric, and Eric said, "You can't fight him." I said, "Why not?" He said, 2 things can happen. One, you're going to kill him, and then you're going to have to move to Bolivia and change your name. Worse, you lose the fight, you move to Bolivia, you change your name. I'm going to read as John Irving. John Irving was a teacher for us. John was a characteristically unemployed writer at the time. He'd published 3 novels, starting with Setting Free the Bears, which was his MFA thesis in '67, and he got smaller sales with each novel. You would see John most afternoons running in a red Speedo along the wrestling thing, but Speedo, along the Iowa River. And he was working on this far-fetched novel called The World According to Garp. An older, experienced writer, this is John Irving, an older, experienced writer can be of use to a young, talented writer. The older writer can at least save that younger writer some time. You can't, in my opinion, convert young writers to a method, and you shouldn't try. You can illuminate your method, but not in a pushy way, as a means of getting them to discover what their method is and how it differs from yours. I don't have a method of teaching writing. I certainly do have a process that I've learned to follow as a writer, but I never urge my process on anyone else. My Iowa students, for example, T.C. Boyle, Ron Hansen, and Alan Garganis, don't write at all like each other, and they shouldn't. They never did. Everyone has something they do too much of. Maybe you do too much of it because you're naturally good at it. But everyone does something to excess, even if what you do to excess is trying to be a minimalist. If you do something to an irritating degree, you should know what it is. Maybe you should not back off from doing it, but you should at least know what irks people. Cocteau used to say that young writers should pay attention to what the critics say, but only the negatives. Because what the critics don't like about you is probably the only original thing you're going to do. Well, that may be true some of the time, or it's true about critics, but writing teachers are not and should not be critics. They should try to help you get better at what you already have a feeling or passion to say.
I'm reading as Jayne Anne Phillips. Writing, or any art, is a calling rather than a career. People enter into an MFA program not to learn to write, but to spend time in a mentor relationship with an accomplished writer or a series of them, and to be part of a community for a scant 2 years that supports literature, reading, and the attempt to write. No one can teach anyone to write, but talented writers can find crucial support and encouragement and learn to edit their own work, which is half the battle within the Academy.
I'm going to be Marvin Bell. Marvin taught here, I think, for 40 years, retired recently, and he's a poet, as I'm sure you know, and his most recent collection, I think, is out now from Copper Canyon. It's Vertigo, the Living Dead Man Poems. He has a whole series now of dead man poems, and in fact, he wrote one for our book. And the title, by the way, came from Marvin. We wanted to be writers. The publisher came up with the subtitle, but We Wanted to Be Writers, Marvin suggested after I told him what I wanted to call it.
I wanted Fighting Norman Mailer.
Yeah. Well, when Marvin heard what I wanted to call it, he said no. Anyway, I'm Marvin Bell. At the heart of being creative is always achieving a point in which the non-rational, the non-logical part of the mind has a chance to go to work. This is true of all creative writing, but it is true with a vengeance if one is writing the sort of poetry that tries to express the otherwise inexpressible. I prefer to write when the pot boils over. Of course, over the years, I have learned how to turn up the heat. I generally write very late at night, beginning after midnight, when the mind loosens its grip on the rational connections one needs in one's utilitarian life. I like staying up late, always have. I write in spurts, always have. If the energy of the language flags, I walk away, which means I lose a lot, since one can't always get back into an unfinished poem, not if the poem has been pushing the envelope. Regardless, I prefer the late hours, and I think they encourage pushing the envelope, and sometimes I write to stamp out my brain. The idea is always to write with abandon. I tend to say yes to whatever comes along.
As Sandra Cisneros. Yes, say yes to everything. What are the worst mistakes a writer can make? Thinking too much. Don't think. It's not about thinking. You think when you edit. When you create, say yes. Yes to everything. When the bell rings and it's the Jehovah's Witness folks, answer the door and say yes. The guy at the door might be in your story. Maybe he'll leave a piece of paper that takes you to the next chapter. Say yes to everything. Nothing's an accident. Later is for the editing, but in the creation, be open, be gentle, like a mother. There's nothing you say no to. Trust that the nonsense you're writing will take you somewhere.
Now I'm going to be Alan Gerganis. I guess you all know who Alan is. His first novel, Oldest Confederate, Widow Tells All, was a bestseller, and all white people, plays well with others, and his most recent, Practical Heart, 4 novellas. And he's working on a new novel. I heard him read a bit of it a few months ago. It was when he was teaching here, and it's going to be terrific. Alan Gerganis. Exactly. Be generous with and to yourself. After that first draft, stash it away a while. Work on other things. I believe in working on many units at once. Let a little distance set in, and then reread it, ideally without a pen in your hand the first time, so you're reading it at exactly the speed with which you wrote it, not interrupting. Reconsider it from start to end. Be mused with a kind of teacherly or parental patience. Of course, I can say, but not always do that. I'll maybe get 2 paragraphs in, trying to read it like that, impartially. Then I'll go, that so sucks, and I whip out the pen.
Alan Gerganis got me into the workshop. It's how you get in, we don't know. There's no sort of, it's a sifting process, but it has some elements of chance. And any given year there'll be, I guess, 800 to 1,000 manuscripts just on the fiction side, and they take 25. And I came to the workshop when I was 21 on the basis of a longish, nutty, I guess, sketch called Kicks, which was the reminiscence of a teenage underwear fetishist who comes to no good end. They always say, write what you know. And Alan wrote across the top of my manuscript, this is nothing like a story, but it's showbiz, let him in. I'm reading this myself. A couple of years ago, a friend of mine, the director of an art gallery in Los Angeles, was putting together a show of African movie posters. I collect these posters, and some of them were going to be in the show, and so he asked me to write the lead essay for the catalog. I started writing it, and I didn't get very far before I came to a grinding halt, out of ideas. I just didn't know what to say, and I'm running out of time, and then I get a little desperate. I happen to mention this problem to an artist friend, and he says, I've got a couple books you ought to look at. So he goes into his studio and comes out with about a dozen books about African art, and I flip one of them open, and there's this photo of an Nkishi, an African power figure, and bingo, suddenly all the pieces of that essay, a real sprawl, came together in my mind, and I knew exactly how to write it. It was that power image, the Nkishi, that brought it all together. Randomly, when I feel stuck, I start looking through books I already own that are tossed on my shelves, or I repair to a good bookstore like Prairie Lights and start browsing. I spend a lot of time in bookstores, and I find something's in there that I need. You wander through a bookstore, and it's like the book you need is calling to you at just the right point.
I'm going to read here as T.C. Boyle. I don't have his hair or his height, but I'll try to do justice to his work. Thanks a lot. And this is, he's talking about his novel for Talk Talk. I had to know about ID theft, and so I got every book I could on the subject, how you do it, the horror stories, the cases, and so on. But it wasn't long until there was no depth to the story. It's about your identity, how you know who you are. You have language. That's how you can name yourself and how you can think. I happened to go to the dentist one day and when I was researching the book, and he was divorced, and he had his eye out for the ladies. And he said to me, the most gorgeous woman in the world was sitting in this chair before you. And you know what? She was deaf. Then he got out the jackhammer and drill, and I realized that my heroine would be deaf. I began to see the possibilities. In my character, if my character were deaf, she'd have a special language, different brain patterns. The deaf from birth are from a different culture with different brain patterns to make that special language really something special.
Alan Garganus, just work every day and only write about things that interest you profoundly. Otherwise, why do it? Dramatic things. I keep a kind of casual journal. I just had the experience of writing in longhand, a kind of inventory of what I'm working on, where it is in its development, a kind of storekeeper's stock-taking. It proved very helpful. A sort of note to self. Anything you can do to give yourself some outside reinforcement. I am writing this book. I have had this problem, but now I feel clearer about character A. Give yourself an alternative forum for talking about these things, like group therapy. It affords another kind of reality, gives the whole process a kind of medical dignity. If you write every day, badly or well or hideously, you're spared ever being technically stopped. I think the hardest part of writing is the starting and stopping. My way is just to continue, and thus the quality comes and goes, but at least I'm writing.
And I'm reading as Jayne Anne Phillips, who, I'm sorry I didn't tell you, is the author of Machine Dreams, Black Tickets, and most recently Lark and Termite. And she teaches the creative writing and runs the creative writing program at Rutgers Newark. Every writer has his or her own relationship to writing. Mine may not be theirs. Thinking about that relationship is part of the process. Whatever I'm working on has to be extremely compelling to me, so compelling that I can put it down for weeks or months at a time and pick it up and re-enter it. Of course, I've never stopped thinking about it. I don't plan my work. I enter into a story or novel through the first line, which at the end, of course, may not be the first line.
See, I can remember when Jayne Anne Phillips showed up in 1976. She was extremely good looking. I think she had a fellowship coming in, and I believe had published a book already. So we were lying in wait. The one thing at the workshop you got the plebe reception. You got hazed the first time you put something up on a worksheet, and so we were waiting. And I happened to be in her class, and I got the worksheet ahead of time. In those days, with no email and didn't have cell phones, you had to call people on a telephone if they heard, they might hear you. Generally, in the workshop, you'd see them on the street. But I got Eric on the telephone, and I said, "Well, we got a problem." He said, "What's the problem?" He said, "You're not going to believe this. It's a very good story. What are we going to do?" I said, "I don't know about you, but I'm going to become very good friends with her. I'm going to read as John Irving. I write last sentences first. I work my way backward from the end of the novel, which is the first thing I know, to what the first chapter should be. By the time I actually write the first sentence, I have a virtual roadmap of the entire novel, either in my notes or inside my head. And in 11 out of my 12 novels, that last sentence, which I wrote first, has never changed. But I don't know anyone else who writes a novel this way. Gordon Lish. Why would I think this is a method worth imposing on young writers? I sincerely doubt that this method would work for anybody else. I think if something happened and I had to teach again, I would be inclined to do it the way I did it when I knew nothing about my own method, when I was still figuring out what to do. Just be patient, be kind, try to figure out what the strengths and the weaknesses of the individual writers are. After all, if writers are not individuals, then no one is. I did not tell T.C. Boyle the same things that I told to Ron Hansen or to Alan Garganus. They are and remain totally different writers. And I noticed very distinctive things in each of them. What good would my generalizing have done them?
As Sandra Cisneros. If you're thinking about the reader or the product, if your head's involved in it, you're blocking the potential for the story to take you someplace fantastic. If your corazon is involved, then, like Betty Davis said, you're in for a bumpy ride. That's where I want to go with my writing. Then the writing goes someplace I never imagined. Don't think too much. Then you'll be able to say something wiser than your years, bigger than yourself. That's what I try to tell writers. Don't get in the way. Step aside. When you sit with your writing long enough, I know from experience, you'll have to walk through a long valley of despair. But if you can get past that, and you're humble enough and service-oriented, if you say to yourself, I'm here to serve, then your higher self, your spirit, God, light, or whatever you want to call it, will take you there. But you have to be ready for that to happen. And I think if you're steering the writing with your head, you're impeding it from happening. It's like Buddhists say, you have to empty yourself to fill up with the everything of the universe.
Alan Gerganis. I do a lot of reading out loud. That's a huge, huge part of what I do, trusting my ear as an editor, imagining reading it to another person, or actually reading it to a real live friend. I have people here, that's in North Carolina, who allow me to come over on short notice and corner them. Amazing how effective it is. Writing is so abstract, so algebraic. Reading it aloud renders all that into real sound waves, makes it into physics. Tremendously important. It helps to imitate how your characters speak, how people talk in a completely different language from the way they use for writing. The way you write about both is a third lingo. The more distinct a character's spoken and written language is, the more opportunities you have for comedy and tension. You hear shortcuts. You hear how many articles and prepositions people leave out. Hand gestures become surrogates for dropped lines. It's hard to write all that in silence.
It's Sandra Cisneros. You need to do whatever you can to keep the work going. It helps if you have a trust fund. It helps if you can do without a lot of sleep. But you have to be obsessed. It's not discipline, but obsession. Right now, I'm trying to do the opposite of Mango Street. I want to do something small and tight. But it's not as if I sit down and write plots or something and see where it leads. I don't feel like I have a plan when I write. For instance, I had an idea for a conversation, so I sat down and started writing a screenplay. I figure the end will evolve out of the process.
I'm reading as myself here. I don't think that young writers tend to get stuck as much as older writers. People ask me that all the time. I think older writers have more debris stuck in their head. And younger writers are much more innocent and will take bigger risks than we will. Or maybe they just get different things stuck in their head. I'm not sure. I give a reading a year. I make a deal with myself that I read only new stories, so I have to write one so that I can stay alive. Maybe if everyone had to give a reading every year, they'd come up with something. Nothing like the looming threat of embarrassing yourself as motivation. I say this for a lot of people in my class and that I've looked up over the years who have never published or published very little. But when I contacted them recently, every one of them was still writing, which tells you a lot about what it means to be a writer.
Rehab doesn't work.
There's no rehab for writers. Once you have it, you're addicted, and you probably never walk away from it. Even though for 30 years you might only produce 20 pages, it's still alive. So now that I contacted these people through the book, I'm getting stories from all these people who have not done a thing in 30 years. If you're away from writing too long, though, I think the internal editor gets stronger, and a lot of things get in between you and what you're trying to do. Not only the editing thing, but other excuses and life's problems. One thing that helps me when I'm stuck is to change circumstances, and here's an example from way back. But once I wanted to enter the Nelson Algren Short Story Contest, and this was in 1995, and I just moved with my family back to Iowa City, and I was walking around my office in circles trying to figure out a story to write. I couldn't. So I made a deal with myself that if I drove to Boulder, Colorado, and I love driving and thinking, I got a hotel room and started typing, and I did. and I ate a little bit of French cuisine to sort of top that off. And I sort of paid myself to write this story. By French cuisine, I meant the stuff in a brown paper bag mostly. And when I left Boulder, I had a story done. And I sent it in and got a Nelson Algren Award. So I'm telling you, if you're a writer, treat yourself well. Paris, Milan, wherever you want to go, just make a deal. If you go there and write a story, it will be a good thing for you to do. We're always suckers for that kind of stuff.
Marvin Bell. He will conclude the reading. I don't need a study made for writing, and indeed I wouldn't feel comfortable in a room with all the advantages. I sometimes stream jazz or alternative music, or doo-wop or classical music on the laptop, but not always. Get up early, stay up late, think of oneself as being a writer every day. Write something, anything, almost every day. Welcome the arbitrary beginning. It's not what one begins with that matters as much as the quality of attention one gives to it afterward. Surrender to the materials. Don't try to satisfy some vague standard or ideal. Rather, try to be interesting to yourself. Stop thinking of literature in the usual ways. Think of the piece at hand as a dance. Writing being a metabolic activity, allied with the breath. Inspiration. For a writer, the act of writing is kinetic, a dance. Again, the idea is always to write with abandon. That's it.
All right, so thank you very much. We'd like to open things up for questions, if anyone has questions.
We believe in the written word. I still write longhand when I write. A number of us do. Some of the writers here still use the same typewriters they've used. And, you know, one thing was valuable in the workshop is you had at any given time 80 or 90, sometimes 100 of your peer group living in very tight confines in downtown Iowa City. So when I was standing out on a corner with a brown bag in my hand, I could look up and see a silhouette. You'd hear clacking, and you'd see a silhouette and go, darn, somebody's writing. Now you can't even hear that. You wouldn't know what's going on.
Up front anyway. I understand that when workshops sort of came about, and I can direct this to anyone who feels qualified to answer, but you kind of went from a time when publishing companies really nurtured their authors, they really sort of guided them and molded them, and then things changed and it was sort of up to the writer, and the workshop maybe filled a void there. I'm wondering if you could say something about that, and things are changing a lot now. I wonder if you have any ideas of what the workshop or workshops in general, what the role could be.
Well, look, back then, and it's a long time ago, there were still event novels. I mean, Jack Leggett, who was the director, said, well, you know, you have to be published in the fall, and it can only be these 3 publishing firms. If you show up in the spring and it's somebody else, you're not really, you know, at the level you need to be as a novelist. We were about the last ones that heard that because the event novel in 1975 was Truman Capote, who was the most known writer in America, publishing Answered Prayers, which ran in a long excerpt, New Yorker or Esquire, I remember which. And you could not find a copy within 60 miles of Iowa City because we all went and got it. And the only thing we learned was, don't let this happen to you. It was unreadable. And maybe the event novel went on from there, but, you know, let Eric talk about this in a minute. I don't know in the workshop today. Sandra Cisneros, who I've had a relationship, known her since she was here, she has a personal editor, Dennis Mathis, who she met here, who edited her in Mango Street, edits everything she writes. My, you know, novel, Holy Shaker Redux, I'm using Don Walsh, who I went to school with here, and Eric and Cheryl. They line edit, follow behind me. So the fact is, you don't get editing unless you're a certain name and they have some money invested in you in a publishing firm today. You're going to write your book. You're going to have someone edit your book. You're going to package your book, and you're going to promote your own book. Because the publishing business, which was always a lousy business with low margins, is looking at some hard times. I hope they don't become the music business.
I guess the sort of follow up on that, I think when we were here in the mid-'70s, we thought we were going to enter the publishing world of old. And we didn't know that it was being transformed, and is still being transformed. And given the fact that I think one part of it may be, I don't know what the cause and effect relationship is, but it used to be that a publisher would carefully edit and nurture a young writer. Publishers don't do that any longer. Now it's the role of the MFA program to do what publishers used to do. And so the MFA, and I think that has something to do with the growth of MFA programs, is because they're filling a void that was left by the transformation of the publishing industry. Gordy, am I?
I'll make one other, look, we're going to buy books. We publish a book, the only bookstores left. Borders was 20% of the trade hardback business in the United States. No longer exists. Barnes & Noble sells Christmas ornaments up at the front. Where do you find a book? You have to find them online. Maybe they go online. So the publishing business, very tough to be in a business where you don't have a place where the consumer can normally find the content. And readership in the United States, I don't know what 20 and 30-year-olds are going to do. I know that 60-year-olds read books. They're generally hardcover. They may have a Kindle, and they might want to walk into a bookstore.
I have one little thing to add. I think some teachers, including myself, have found a number of students who we think are really good, for instance. And if you want to just throw them out there into the world, they're going to suffer a lot because their books are incomplete, or they're not focused, or they're not finished. So I have found a number of students, three, I guess, altogether. I think we've published 9 novels that I've mentored from the first beginning draft to the last draft. All the novels are published. They've done very well, but it was a lot of work. And I'm doing 2 right now, as a matter of fact. But the problem is the editors have given terrible advice most of the way through, and agents even worse. In the old days, agents used to be pretty good readers, I think, and the ones I've met recently, they follow along with their finger when they read. I mean, it's not very good.
Well, they're waiting to the part where the vampire comes.
Yeah, they want some blood sucking so they can make a lot of money. But they do appreciate, and this is the good part of this, they appreciate a well-edited novel. You've done it yourself, or you've had someone mentor it. The very first novel I did, I worked on very hard to prove I could do it. There was not a change made when it was between the last copy and the one that they published. And everyone's very happy, and with that publishing house, it's worked out very well. But other times I've seen people come to me crying and say, my novel, the editor tore it apart, or just before we went to press, she left and orphaned my book, and now I have nobody to talk to about my next one. I have a 3-book deal. So it's a mess, really, out there. The key is to find somebody you trust, who you'll let give you good advice, and I think that's a really necessary thing to have these days. I guess you can buy advice from people. There are a lot of people out there, if you give them $1,000, they will comment on your novel. I wouldn't pay anybody anything like that unless I really trusted them and knew them personally. So there is kind of another business developing out there of helping people get published, and good books get published. So.
Yeah. Gordon, I answered some of my question. Originally the workshop started you had competition, and then you had camaraderie. Now you have this huge business model change in publishing and editing and book writing. Where does the workshop fit in the long-term new business model?
Well, Glenn can talk about that. Part of that question, or part of my answer to that, would be Elizabeth Bishop said a long time ago that she hated the business of poetry. By that she meant she loved writing poems, but she hated everything else that had to do with poetry. Trying to get published, finding the right magazine, listening to critics, that part drove her crazy. And I think that's still true with writers today. Just making a short story or a play or a screenplay or a novel is a lot of work. If you try to make that thing with a business model stuck in your head, I don't know how you do those two things at the same time. You'll end up doing what Glenn just mentioned. You'll say, oh, maybe a vampire would fit in here. You know, because that would be a lot of money if I could do that. And then by God, you know, one does show up suddenly, and then you've ruined the whole book. So the temptation is to think about money as you make art. You know, I don't know, Andy Warhol did it pretty well, but I'm not Andy Warhol. So.
Look, from the difference, I can't answer the question about how they teach in the workshop today. The difference between the middle 70s and 2011 is vast. I believe that one of the competitive advantages of the workshop has always been scale. Other workshop programs in 1975 had 4 people in them, 6 people in them. They'd all be destined to be your enemies. So, you know, Irvine, Brown, Montana. There might have been 12 MFA programs in the United States in 1975 when I came here. I would tell you that half of all MFA students in the United States were at Iowa. And so you were going to find your group. Today, I don't know, because it depends which, you know, writer today you pick up, but there's 300 programs. Novels don't seem to be getting any better, but we now have 300 MFA programs, and, you know, somewhere around 100 million, you know, American candidates for the MFA. They don't read. And so there's an institutionalized business called the workshop, and that method, I think, has been pretty much engendered by Iowa, and I can't say what it does in terms of maybe being some form of a substitute for what you thought you were going to get when Maxwell Perkins was, you know, helping you write your first novel.
I just want to add one thing about the institutionalization of the workshop. I think painting, for instance, has been institutionalized for a long time. So has ceramics. So I don't, you know, it shouldn't be a surprise that writing eventually got institutionalized as well. I mean, all art forms now are usually within the university. So people tend to pick out the workshops and writing as some exception or some rarity to that rule or violating some rule in the arts. It's not true at all. We just joined the club, actually. So I don't feel there's a very good argument of that writing shouldn't have been institutionalized since every other art form was. I hung out with poets and I hung out with painters when I was here, and you know, we all felt we were part of the same group. So I don't like that sort of division that goes on.
Well, Gertrude Stein had a writer's workshop in 1922, and you haven't had more decorations come out of a single place at one time until 1975 to 7, I guess, when we got here.
You know, whatever is happening in publishing world and technology and e-books and so on, some things haven't changed, and when we started this book, it hadn't occurred to me how important being part of a community is to a young writer. I mean, I was part of a community here, but I wasn't aware of how important it was to me then, and I really didn't become aware of this value of the workshop until I started interviewing people for this book.
So for a person who has a full-time job because they have kids to support and can't really afford in any way to be in a workshop like this, do you have any suggestions for finding that community and finding a good editor?
They exist. Sandra Cisneros will do workshops. Alan Gerganis has had his own personal workshops where people sort of, you know, come and he accepts tuition. I'm right in saying that. I think that's true. I know Sandy does it. So there you can find them, and I would imagine Iowa City is a pretty good place to look. There is no more writerly community in the United States that has compact size. And what makes Iowa special? You have to come here. And there's almost no good way out.
That said, you can also be part of the community now through the internet. I mean, you know, it's interesting. When we were here in Iowa, there was no internet. And am I supposed to? I'm sorry. There was no internet, of course, and it was that long ago. But Alan Gerganis in the book, he talks about, several people talked about how difficult it was for them as young writers right out of the workshop. They were no longer part of a community. And Alan talks about this. You know, this is back when we would write letters on paper and put them in envelopes and put a stamp on it. It's unimaginable. And he talks about how that lag, he'd send a piece of a work to a friend of his, and days or weeks would go by before he'd hear it back, and he talked about how painful that lag was. And he had some, you know, he was a little depressed at the time, right out of the workshop. And he said email has changed everything. And so you can be part of a community of writers through email, through the internet. And now there's this huge growth of low residency programs where you're part of a writing community and then you meet for a few days, a few times a year. Marvin Bell runs some of these. So.
You know, leaving Iowa is like getting let out of the joint. I mean, you miss it immediately. You know, like the door clangs behind you, you have the cheap suitcase, and you're looking up and down the dusty road, and you can't go back in, and you don't know where to go.
Tell us how, what it's like in the workshop. What do? You write a story a week, you write a story a day, you sit and critique other stories. Tell us how it works.
Yeah. Well, geez.
I presumably, I haven't sat in one since 1977. Yeah, for a while, the way it worked, it was if you were in the fiction workshop, you met on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And you put up that you read typically in a 3-hour seminar, writing seminar, you read 2 stories. And you got them on Monday. Sometimes you get them before. This was in fiction.
Somebody else's stories? Or?
Yes. And you put up a worksheet once or twice. I treated Iowa kind of like a low residency program when I was here. I put one up a year, but yeah, and there was no minimum. Eric wrote about 50 stories every 2 weeks, so he always had a thick pile that was before the class. But you find your own group. I'm going to talk about. I mean, typically, I don't know if that's still the case. I mean, I remember anywhere from 12 to 15 people sitting around a table, typically in the round, and you would pre-release your story to 4 or 5 readers that you had some confidence in. In fact, you might share that story ahead of time. My idea of the Iowa Writers Workshop was, I can't find that booth, but a booth at the mill where I sat most nights, and our folks would come around, and that's where you'd start talking about your stories. And for me, after a while, the institution of the workshop, particularly in the second year, was of no particular matter. I'd found 5 or 6 people whose reading intelligence matched where I thought my voice was going. And I don't think I could have met those people, who are still my friends 35 years later, if I'd been anywhere but the Iowa Writers Workshop. Whether or not faculty made incisive commentary or led you to be able to produce better writing, that might be dubious. You followed by example. You actually, in my experience, when you saw a good story written by one of your fellow workshoppers, I felt vindicated. I thought I was right. I'm with the right people, at the right place, at the right time. We're about to get better. One more. Thanks.
Stephen King makes fun of the workshop, not the Iowa Writers Workshop, but a lot of the, you said 800 workshops
yes.
now, because he says it's like sitting around a campfire, making your s'mores, and then you go in and you're not best friend. And these people that are critiquing you don't know what the hell they're talking about. Why is Iowa different than that? Because of the selectivity of it?
Well, I don't know that I would necessarily agree with Stephen King. I hesitate to disagree with him.
Well, we do acknowledge in the book, when what are the 10 best books we know about writing process, we do have King's book on that.
Yeah, but I don't know if I agree with him. But Iowa, it was the first, and it set a standard, and I think it pretty much established the workshop method, if there is one, and if it's different, it's big, it has the reputation, it gets the best applicants, and
it's
so it has a big pool of really good young writers to draw from.
Well, look, what it is, I don't think the numbers have changed. Sam Chang's in the back of the room. I'm going to guess you still get 1,000 of these, applications a year. You pick 25, which means Iowa gets how much? 1,200. 1,200 applications a year. You pick 25, which means Iowa always gets first draft choices. I mean, if you were an NFL football team and you got the first 25 choices out of every college every year, you'd go 18-0 every single season.
And one thing, there are different kinds of workshops. I mean, the Iowa model out there has been replicated all over the place. But if you look at the top maybe 50, they're pretty much the same. Beyond that, there are many colleges who actually have an MFA program to support the English department, because you have to take courses in the English department. And they use you for TAs, and they don't care whether you're a very good writer or not. So they're actually, you're just part of the machine. And I discourage my students from applying there. A couple of years ago, a student of mine got into one of those programs, and they give grades. And so she got a B- in her first fiction workshop and was ready to, shoot herself. And I said, I didn't want you to go there because of that. You're taking Chaucer, Shakespeare, you're a TA, and you're taking 2 writing workshops. I wouldn't wish that on anybody. So my advice is to pick a good program, and you'll be treated well. One thing about writing out in the cold world, though, there are places like the Iowa Summer Writing Festival, and I teach in that. It's one you can come and take a week's class or a weekend. My students keep up with each other over the year during the internet. They read each other's stories. They talk. They meet here at Prairie Lights if they're local, and that's a real advantage to living in Iowa City. And it's reasonably priced, and you'll get to meet a lot of people in a hurry. So I recommend that. And by the way, writing novels for people sounds like a terrible thing. And one of my first people I mentored, his name is Bart Yates, and I made a deal with him. If he wrote a page a day, I would try to help him get published. And I didn't think he would do it. I did this in July. And about December 30th, he called me up and said, I'm done. I wrote a page a day, and I have the novel done. And sure enough, that was his first published novel. But he wrote a page a day. That was his rule. Cut and dried, and he did it, and it was very good. So
lucky Gordy didn't try to mentor me. All right, thanks.
Thank you very much. We have Glenn Schaeffer, Eric Olsen, also Gordon Menninga. I'm Kathleen Johnson.